Um, Today, I'm going to give you an overview of places data, or more often called points of interest data. Naturally, because I work at SafeGraph, it'll be through the lens of SafeGraph, but most of the principles that we'll touch on are applicable throughout the spatial data world, which I'll give a generic overview of in the beginning of my presentation. And then from there, we'll shift to why it's important, kind of the meat and potatoes of the data itself, and then the use cases that folks are typically using spatial data and specifically points of interest data for, and also what they're not using it for. So I'll start with a maybe 10 or 20-second intro on myself. I'm Fletcher, as the intro mentioned. I'm a PM at SafeGraph, and within SafeGraph, I'm specifically on the Places team. We have other teams focused on some of the other types of spatial data that we provide, which you'll find in this slide here. So within our team, we are focused on points of interest, which are one-dimensional points on a spatial plane representing a physical place in the real world, as well as associated geometries. So for example, if you're at Fletcher's Cafe in Manhattan, you have the one-dimensional point as well as the building footprint around it. Though they're not necessarily building footprints, perhaps they're a campus or a lake or what have you. And that definition goes far beyond what we provide when you're looking generically in the spatial data world. And then you also see we have these other two at the end titled patterns and spend. And while I'm not on those teams, I often interact with them. Patterns being focused on anonymized, keyword anonymized and aggregated mobility data that you can append to a particular location to understand visitation over time and what have you, and make comparisons to other locations, both directly and at scale, and then spend data to understand where the former three fit in trying to get a better sense of the economy in a particular region, and again, at varying scales. So as I mentioned, we're going to focus on places today. Places are often seen as kind of the least exciting. So I'm going to try to get you excited about them and tell you why they're really foundational to the other three types of data you typically find in the spatial data world, and can even really be seen as the keystone to anything you do thereafter. So first of all, what do places look like? You'll see it's capitalized because we like really straightforward names in our branding at SafeGraph, so we just literally call them places, but you will typically hear that used generically in the space as well. Essentially, you have the location in the form of a lat long as well as an address, and then anything that you can append to that location that's relevant. I really like this definition here. This is the moonshot goal we have of everything that isn't a single family home, because we don't want to be mapping where individuals live. Of course, there is no provider of spatial data who has everything that is not a single family home, but that's very much the goal that we're always tracking towards. So to my earlier point, there are obvious examples like every McDonald's in the world or the laundromat down the street from me here in Manhattan. But sometimes it's stuff you wouldn't even think of, like a silo on a farm filled with corn. People care about that, particularly at scale, all the way to a boat dock or even a lamppost. Now, not all of those are useful for most people, and not all of those are found in our data. Not surprisingly, at SafeGraph, given that we're a business, we tend to skew towards points of interest that are either also businesses or in some capacity really relevant to folks operating commercially. But we do nonetheless have a pretty tremendous variety of them in the data. Now on the right, you'll see an actual screenshot of our doc site detailing the schema. And a lot of this stuff seems pretty straightforward, but is actually incredibly difficult to obtain and to ensure quality around, which I'll touch on in a couple more slides. But just to wrap this one up, you'll see key fields, brand affiliation, industry codes and categories. If you don't have clean categories, then it can be difficult, if not impossible, to make clean queries or to query the data at all. And then opened on and closed on dates. If a location is no longer open, that's something certainly we want to be aware of, as we want to be aware of when it opened in general. Now, how do we get to quality? This is kind of the crux or core directive of my job. Let's start with first the questions we would want to ask as to why we should even care. The number one question we're trying to answer is something that if you're simply used to spatial data through the lens of being a lay user of a Google Maps or Apple Maps on your iPhone, you're not even thinking about. You're just expecting it to work at your fingertips. But it's actually an incredibly difficult problem to solve for globally, and it's one that has not yet been solved for globally. And that is, where is this place? Once we find the place, and that first step being the hardest part, the next question is, what kind of place is this? Is this a school? Is this a bookstore? Is this a post office? Is this a football field? Is this a trailhead, etc.? Then as we start to aggregate a large number or a decent number of places, and we're categorizing them and labeling the type, we can start to ask questions of where certain types of places are clustered or not clustered. Then as we identify clusters, we can move on to more complex questions saying, how does this place have relationality, or does it have any relationality to other places? And that's kind of the first pass at what we might call spatial analysis, understanding relationships across the spatial plane. Then to my earlier point on the last slide, when is this place opening or closing each day if it's a business? When did it open at first, and did it potentially close permanently? These questions were particularly pertinent during COVID, as you could certainly imagine, and I'll do a deeper dive on that in a moment. Also, when we're dealing with brands, which we have a particular column for, so you could think of, understanding where every Pep Boys is, I can ask the question, okay, here's this Pep Boys, how many other Pep Boys are there in the state of New York or California, or how far is this from the next one? I'd really like to drill this idea down of accuracy versus precision. This, to the point that I made when I started the presentation, is not something that's simply found at SafeGraph, but is a general idea that you want to always come back to when you're evaluating spatial data, or really any data, but particularly spatial data. And it harkens back to the one-to-one problem that is found in mapping way before any sort of digitization in mapping or the advent of computers. And that's this idea that it's impossible to create a one-to-one scaled map. So because you can't make a perfect representation of ultimate reality, as you show differing scales, there are always sacrifices that you need to make. And along with those sacrifices comes a shift in accuracy and precision. When it pertains to SafeGraph's data set or spatial data sets with POIs in them specifically, we start with accuracy on the individual location scale. So here's Fletcher's Cafe. I have a truth set with the actual location of it. It would probably, practically speaking, be a very accurate lat long with many decimal points on the latitude and longitude appended to it. And then I look at that in relation to SafeGraph's data or some other provider's data, and I ask, how close are they? So if they're very, very, very close, then it's very, very, very accurate. Precision, on the other hand, is how often am I accurate and to what degree? So maybe with accuracy, I see that this point and the building footprint associated with it is within a meter or less of ultimate reality in this truth set that I have on hand. And then in precision, I look at every single building in New York City, and I see that we are, 95% of our points of interest and their associated geometries are within a meter of the centroid or the geometry or the footprint or what have you. And there's a variety of ways to measure it, but essentially accuracy is for a particular point, and precision is scaling that and asking how often are we accurate to the level that we would hope to have. This is just a slide on routinely hitting a moving target, and the idea is that And this is what I really want to drive home. I know you're probably going to a good number of webinars, and I don't expect you to remember everything that I say, but if there's one thing that I could really drive home when it comes to points of interest data and why you should care, it's the fallacy of them being static. And this idea that the point on your map, and I'll keep using your iPhone or Android device as an easy example, but the place that you see when you search for nearest pet store on your phone is not a permanent place. And the deli you've maybe walked by since childhood that's still there is nonetheless impermanent, in that at some point, whether 5 years from now or 100 years from now, it's going to close or change ownership or in some capacity change. We want to measure that change, and that change essentially implies, and this is the point I really want to make, that points of interest aren't static, but are rather dynamic. And anywhere there's dynamism, there's something to be learned or gleaned from measuring it. The most common way is to be measuring, at least in our world, whether the place is still operating. And that can be applied to a wide variety of locations, businesses being the most obvious, but even something like a post office or an industrial facility. You can zoom out and ask questions that I'll touch on a few slides from now of, is this a pattern of opening or closing? And what could that potentially lead to in terms of an investment, for example, in public equities found within the sector that I'm looking at. We also want to measure something like a name change or rebrand. That's more useful for individual points, but it can be useful at scale. Acquisitions and mergers, particularly because we actually have the ticker symbol appended to locations that are operated or owned by public equities. And then hours changing, that might be something that's interesting. Again, you can see where COVID is kind of the perfect example of having widespread change that affects nearly all of these points. And of less use, but still important, especially for some clients who are actively reaching out to businesses, is the phone number no longer up to date? Let's make sure that that is in fact up to date. Things to consider in terms of quality. All of these are important. The one that I'm most interested in speaking to right now is number 3. We kind of just touched on number 2 in the last slide as number 1 in the slides before it. But update cadence is the one that I obsess over on my team, and that doesn't get much love, but is really, really hard and extremely important. So what I mean by that is, how often are we refreshing over a given POI or the totality of the database? At SafeGraph, we shoot for a monthly update cadence, which in our world is really, really fast and really, really hard to pull off. I would feel comfortable saying that the normal cadence that you'll encounter is somewhere around a quarterly update cadence or even less, and it trails off as you get into markets beyond the United States or Canada or Western Europe, where data can be more difficult to find and get signal on. Why does update cadence matter? Well, if I'm just going to use COVID as the example for pretty much all of this, because it's just such an accessible one. But you think of where I live here in New York with COVID entering into the picture in March of 2020. If you're only able to look at which businesses are open and still in operation every 3 months, you're just not measuring the effect that this pandemic is having on the landscape and on commerce in that particular region. And having 3 times the fidelity with the monthly update cadence can be a matter of making an accurate decision or not even being in a position to make one. In terms of getting the data right, what goes into ensuring that we do a good job? This might be the shortest sentence that I point to, and I've kind of already said it, but it's hard. If you wanted one summary that's accurate, I would say it's hard. I'll touch on some of these points here. Address normalization is exceedingly difficult because we as humans really love to name things at random or creatively. And English is particularly a hard language. Fun fact, English has by far the most words of any language. And in having millions of words at our disposal, we tend to throw them at the places around us, and then folks like myself have to make sense of them and turn them into meaningful data sets that you can rely on. You could think of boulevard versus abbreviated boulevard as an easy example. This problem becomes even harder when you get out to other languages. For example, in German, you're often appending within the German language the word street to the main descriptor, and then it becomes one word. So how do you tell the data to parse itself out into intelligible parts? You have to have an address parser that can understand those differences. Another example is folks who have creative names. So for example, there's bars that intentionally have a funny name so that if you're buying something there, it doesn't show up as anything particularly scandalous on your credit card. So I think there's one that's just called The Office in Denver. Well, that's going to register through RAI as an office, but it's in fact a speakeasy. So how can we make sure that we're picking up the POIs in the right way and continuing to categorize them effectively at scale? Also, geocoding being making sure that you have an accurate latitude, longitude associated with a point of interest. They can be exceedingly difficult because the idea of what is the actual true point that we want to start with varies from place to place and provider to provider and source to source. So you'll often hear the term centroid, so the center of the building. That can be really misleading if you have an awkward building polygon and you're trying to calculate the centroid. It can also be difficult because you'll find folks not using the centroid of a building, but instead using the front entrance or some other entrance. And you can just imagine when you're dealing with a giant mall in New Jersey, how difficult it is to discern which point is the best point to use for the wide variety of clients and use cases that we serve. And then actually just validity itself. How do we dedupe the data? That's a huge part of the work that we're focused on. How do we know that this is in fact a place? And I keep coming back to this, but how do we know that it's still open? On the point of making sure that it is in fact open or not, interestingly, I think folks fairly think of something being open or closed as kind of a Boolean question. You know, it either is or it isn't, but it's very subjective, in fact. And this becomes a nightmare when you get outside of the United States, which I'll touch on in a moment. But even within the United States, open is the easy one. The business is open. We're seeing signal from it, and the signal could be anything from something that's crawled to it's some first-party data that we're privy to from the business itself to actual boots on the ground visitation recently. Whatever it is, we're confident that it had opened at this date. That's pretty easy to handle in comparison to closed on, which is very subjective. So if you're not hearing signal, is the business closed permanently, or was it just closed that day or that hour? You can see where if there's boots on the ground collection, it's all over the place. Was the person on a lunch break when the visitation took place? Is the website down, or is the entire business down? Are they closed for the season, or are they closed in perpetuity, or have they just moved locations? The best way to deal with this is to build a model that has a varying degree of decay for different factors, and then introduce some sort of human verification on top of that, and that's exactly what we do with SafeGraph. Freshness, keeping it fresh. This kind of goes back to the last slide, but ultimately doing the boring things right is the answer here, and that means constant review and deduping. So obsessing on deduping is arguably one of the most important things to make sure that it is fresh, because we don't want to be sending to our clients or the orgs that work with us redundant records. And then randomly sampling whenever we can to make sure that we're not missing some glaring defect that could be present in more of the database than we were aware of. And then finally, validating against other truth sets is a core part of ensuring that our data is precise. And to my point at the beginning, that's not something that just SafeGraph does. That's something that any spatial data player would be doing, and hopefully doing really well and obsessively and even neurotically. I'll touch on some of these. Transactions data, which I mentioned we also provide, can be a very useful bellwether or truth set against whether a business is open, because if we're not seeing any activity, it's probably not, unless they switch to some other form of spend. But most likely that's a very strong signal that we should at least investigate further. Foot traffic, similarly for open and close, if we're seeing that no one's visiting the area, that's a very, very relevant point of data, and would again lead us to feel more confident in saying this place is closed. Or on the flip side, maybe we got a false negative that a place is closed, but we're seeing tremendous visitation. Maybe it's just that the business that used to be there is closed, but there's a new business already up, and that was missed within the window of our update cadence, or something else went wonky. But we certainly want to know, are people visiting this place? Is money being transacted? That's going to at least narrow the scope of understanding what's going on. For satellite imagery, it's particularly useful in the realm of geometry, but it can also be useful in the realm of points of interest. It's really the closest thing we have to a snapshot of ultimate reality. And so we might be able to see that the geometry that we have on hand is quite shifted from imagery that we're comparing it to. Or maybe we accidentally caught a snippet of a parking lot, thinking that it was a part of the interior building. We use satellite imagery pretty heavily in the geometry side of our product suite, but it can be useful for a wide variety of applications. And then, of course, making sure that we're running all of our data through models and introducing a human element to pick up on things that were lost from the previous 4 examples of validation methods. So I failed to mention in the intro what my role specifically within Places is. I am on, or in charge of, or co-in charge of, I guess you could say. We don't have fancy titles at SafeGraph. I'm just a product manager, but I'm focused on specifically global data. And global data is fun because all of the things that I just mentioned are contingent on even having good signal to make those decisions, which are already hard to begin with, even if the data that you're building these data sets with is hypothetically perfect. The farther you get into emerging markets, the less perfect it is, and that's where it becomes exciting, but also daunting, if not impossible to solve for. I touched a little bit earlier on language. Language is one of the biggest struggles. It keeps me interested. Thankfully, I like my job, but biggest struggles of my job, because you have to ask the question, do we want to be looking at sources that are in English, or should we be looking at sources that are in the local language? And if we go with the latter, which we often or usually do, how do we make sure that, for example, burger joints in Pakistan can be queried and understood against burger joints in the United Kingdom, all in a clean, universal way in the totality of our data, if someone were to come to us and want all burger joints for the world. Very hard problem. It gets really, really fun when you're introducing different types of alphabets and need to Romanize them, and when there's colloquial terminology that we ourselves are familiar with. Fortunately, we have a ton of languages spoken at SafeGraph. I actually, early in my SafeGraph career, asked that question in our random channel on Slack. And I think by my count, there was something like 35 languages spoken. Unfortunately, there are thousands in the world. So we're just scratching the surface there. And it's constantly on my mind when trying to understand how we can expand. And in fact, I am often looking at the world not through the lens of political boundaries when trying to expand our coverage, nor just categories, but linguistic regions, because there's so much congruency between, for example, a Bangladesh to the east of India and the Bengali portion of India speaking the same language around Calcutta, its 3rd largest city, more so than the north of India to the south of India, which speaks completely different languages, such as Hindi versus Tamil, totally different script, entirely different part of the Indo-European language tree. So you get pretty into the weeds pretty fast, but I also have a lot of fun with it. Localized addresses, I touched on this a little bit earlier, but the hierarchy and how addresses are actually displayed can get really wonky really quickly. I'll use an example from Great Britain that I think is fun. It's a residential example, so we would never have it in our database, but it's just accessible to the English speakers on this call. But in the UK, for those of you who haven't spent time there, there is this grandfathered in taxonomy for addresses where far before the advent of cars, people just named their houses like they named their boats. And those are still legally legitimate. And you have to figure out how to make sense of a place called Bag End, to reference The Hobbit, and find out what the lat long of Bag End is. Not an easy problem. Or for example, right now I'm looking at Japan. The way that addresses are delineated is entirely different from how it's done in the US in terms of subdivisions, the types of codes appended to them, so on and so forth. And making sure that that data can still be compared against American data or Brazilian data is a core part of our job as we expand globally. Then you'll see on regional specifications, it's not extraordinarily difficult, though it is difficult to figure out where all of the locations for a Fortune 500 company is, just because they're often very public with that, especially if their business is customer facing, like a restaurant or a global retail group. But if that's all what we had in our data, we wouldn't have much to show for global coverage. So getting regional brands is really difficult, and often we're reliant on our teams abroad who can just even make us aware of the fact that there is a bank that's the #1 bank in Buenos Aires that I've never heard of, that I would have just completely passed by had I not had that local knowledge. And then once we're aware of its existence, how can we make sure that we can have that coverage in the data, and how can we continue to ask that question in the 193 or so countries in the world? I'm going to jump now to some of the use cases we see. These are by no means exhaustive, and I'll start with just a slide that you can get a sense of what the data would look like visualized. So this is just a Nike town in London. I've actually been to this Nike town, and you'll see that there's a little pop-up here in the location name, as well as the brand that it maps to, and then the category is found, as well as the opened on timeline. There's more. You'll see that it's a screenshot of a pop-up. There's many more attributes that we can surface here, but it gives you a rough pass at just kind of where it is and the core attributes that we want to be familiar with. On the other hand, on this other map to the right, you'll see that someone's queried our data and visualized it. I believe this is in Cardo's platform. And you'll see that the top category in this particular location, of this particular, let's see, in this particular location is management of companies and enterprises. And then the particular location that's been selected or clicked on is Capital One. And then the NAICS code, which is an industry code that's kind of the gold standard in North America, is labeled at the bottom. So you can query based on that NAICS code and then see all of the geometries and points associated with them for that particular category of location. I'll briefly touch on retail. Retail is one that we see pop up constantly, which is no surprise. The first question that we want to ask, to harken back to my first slide, is where is everything? Believe it or not, you can't ask that very easily all the time and at scale. So let's just get a sense of where every CVS is, where every Walgreens is, and where every Rite Aid is, and put it all on a map. Already in this seemingly boring effort here, we're starting the process of what we could call spatial analysis, because we're getting a sense of coverage as it varies within Connecticut in this particular example. And we can see that CVS is quite dominant. It particularly is dominant as we get down into the southwest of Connecticut, where you're in the suburbs of New York City. But it maintains dominance towards the center of the state and really just about everywhere, with the other two kind of displayed haphazardly around the state. Once we have a sense of where they are, we can ask questions like what else is there, not just within that sector of pharmacies, but what else is present in the areas where these businesses are clustered. So if I'm CVS, I might want to know, even though I think of myself as a pharmacy, I might want to know that there's a ton of delis nearby because they're going to probably be in some way indirectly competing because I carry a lot of things on my shelf that have nothing to do with pharmaceuticals, like a Reese's peanut butter cup, and someone might be deciding whether I want to go to a CVS to get that Reese's or whether I want to go across the street to a local deli. So just getting a lay of the land is almost always the first question we're going to ask. There also might be the reverse situation where there's a brand from another sector or a relevant sector that tends to correlate strongly with high performance. So a great example that I always bring up, I'm a native Californian. I'm trying to hold my Southern Californian accent back from you and sound articulate, but I'm very much Californian. And in California, there's a super high correlation, especially in Southern California, but throughout all of the Western United States, between gas station spend and In-N-Outs, because people treat In-N-Out like a local religion. So where there's an In-N-Out, the likelihood that someone's going to pull off and spend at the nearest gas station is actually astronomical, and it's super fun to map the correlation. So if I'm In-N-Out or if I'm the gas station, I'm going to want to know where the other is. You also see this in terms of understanding gentrification. So retail can be a great bellwether for understanding gentrification. You actually might have heard of the term the Starbucks effect. Without taking any opinion on the ethics around gentrification, but just trying to understand how it's unfolding, you can quite accurately actually look at the expansion of Starbucks over time into a particular area, such as Brooklyn here in New York City, and you will see more often than not a trailing of higher ended businesses and then a rising of rents. That relationship can be mapped in the reverse with brands or types of businesses that are correlated with a reversing of gentrification or with low-income neighborhoods, and you can start to ask really interesting questions at scale in an urban environment. I'm going to then take this to the international example that we've got on hand here. Essentially, the questions are the same. The difference here is understanding the data when we're trying to build it and making sure that it's clean for you. So I'll probably kind of breeze past this slide, but we have a lot of people who are operating in the markets that we've traditionally served, which have for years now been the US, Canada, and the UK, and we've since expanded globally over the last year. And they say, look, I'm a coffee shop with a Northeast regional presence, and we're considering going into Western Europe, potentially Germany, Sweden, and Belgium. Can you give us a lay of the land of what's there so we can get a sense of what we'd be competing against or how likely we are to be performant if we were to expand our footprint there? So same questions as before, just much harder data to clean up and make useful to the end client, and that's really a core responsibility of our job on our Places team within the greater product org at SafeGraph. Mapping, this is one that a lot of folks don't even think about. I touched on this earlier. Mapping is kind of a made-up term because it can vary from company to company, but essentially the actual applications or organizations that help you as a lay user know where things are. So if you think of just the default mapping app on your phone, we take for granted that we just expect things to be in there, but it's actually really, really difficult, and that information is also not often that accurate. So we think of Google as being perfect, and I am by no means opposed to Google. I am a big fan of Google Maps, or at least have been historically, and definitely use it on my phone. But if you open Google in Nigeria, you're going to find that a lot of the points don't exist, and you might be standing in front of a five-star restaurant and it's simply not present in the application. And that's no critique of of Google. That's just a great example of just how hard and how widespread this problem is, and solving for its difficulty. So mapping companies, they just want to know where things are, and they want to know at tremendous scales. So we try to help them do exactly that. At SafeGraph, we don't have an application. We're agnostic in terms of who we work with. We just obsess over our rows and columns and hope that ours are better than anyone else's. I don't want to be too promotional here. That would ideally be the goal of anyone operating in our space. But we're just ultimately slinging CSV files that can be translated into physical locations and information about those physical locations. Advertising visit attribution. So this is kind of working in reverse. So when you're seeing places data out in the POI landscape, you're often, if not usually, starting with POIs, and then you're intersecting it with information that's a little more complex. Like you saw on my slide with the 4 types of products that we work on, there are certainly others that folks provide that we don't. But most common one is mobility data. There's actually the reverse scenario where a client or organization might have the mobility data, but they don't have accurate places data to intersect it with. So a common example is, a company that might have an application with an SDK and they have a general sense of movement within a particular area, but they're not able to intersect it with locations to make sense of it. And if you have a cluster of visitation around, in this example, around the Las Vegas Strip, but you don't know around what casino, it's not very valuable. And all you can really say is on the corner of South Las Vegas Boulevard and Flamingo, there's a clustering of people at this date and time across this time span. It's much more useful to say that this is taking place at or nearby the Paris Hotel, which is owned by Caesars Entertainment. And now we're really getting somewhere. And those questions and the answers that we get from them might be useful for deciding whether or not that is a public equity that we want to take a pass at investing in, for example, because we're seeing that the visitation across all of their portfolio has been tremendous in relation to other casino operating groups in the United States in that quarter. So I'm going to wrap up here with just how you can actually access our data if you were to be interested. You can download a CSV from our shop. And if you're interested, I can actually get you a little promo code. I'm just Fletcher at SafeGraph. I'd be happy to help you. I'm not on the sales team, but I am a data nerd, so always here to help out folks, especially at ODSC. Or you could reach out for bulk access across an entire region or category or brand, and they can help you from there. Partner integrations. Understandably, a lot of folks want to work in the environment they're already comfortable with. So you'll see that we work with the likes of Databricks and Snowflake and AWS and Esri. There are many more. These are some of the most common, but there is a strong push and always has been to make sure that getting you the data is seamless so that all you can think about is asking questions of it. And finally, we do have an API. So one of the common examples of why someone would want to use the API over a bulk download is, maybe you're asking in an application, what's the nearest Taco Bell, as you see on here, or how many blah, blah, blahs are within X distance of Y, rather than needing to view or access the totality of SafeGraph's data. But that's all I've got for today, so I can open it up for questions. And thank you for the time.